Ever wonder how people saw anything after sunset without flipping a light switch? Can you imagine stumbling around in total darkness just to find your bed? The Middle Ages weren't called the Dark Ages just for their cultural setbacks. They were literally dark. Number 7. Rushlights, the poor man's candle. Have you ever been so broke you couldn't afford basic necessities? Medieval peasants knew that feeling all too well, especially when it came to lighting their homes. While nobles enjoyed fancy beeswax candles, common folk had to get creative with what they had, and what they had were rushes. Rushlights were basically the medieval equivalent of dollar store lighting. Peasants would gather rushes tall, reed-like plants from marshy areas, peel them and dry them out. Then came the gross part, dipping these dried rushes in animal fat or leftover kitchen grease. Imagine the smell. The resulting rushlight was essentially a long, thin, greasy plant stem that could be lit at one end and would burn slowly, giving off just enough light to avoid walking into walls. These makeshift candles were super inefficient by today's standards. They'd burn for maybe 15 to 20 minutes tops before you needed a new one. That's why medieval homes often had special rushlight holders, metal clips elevated on stands, where people could place their burning rushes. When one began to sputter out, they'd simply light the next one and keep the dim glow going. The worst part: rushlights smoked like crazy and smelled like a combination of burning plants and rancid animal fat. Talk about air pollution. Medieval ceiling beams were often blackened from years of rushlight smoke. Plus, they were major fire hazards. Many a medieval home went up in flames because someone dozed off with a rushlight still burning. But hey, when you're a peasant working from dawn till dusk and you need just enough light to eat your gruel before collapsing onto your straw mattress, rushlights did the job, sort of. Number 6. Oil lamps, ancient tech that kept on burning. Did you know people were using basically the same lighting technology for thousands of years? Oil lamps weren't some medieval invention. They'd been illuminating homes since ancient Egypt and Rome. But medieval folks definitely put them to good use. The basic oil lamp design was stupidly simple yet effective. A container for oil, a wick, and maybe a handle if you were feeling fancy. Medieval oil lamps came in all sorts of materials depending on how rich you were. Peasants used simple clay vessels, while nobility might flaunt fancy bronze or even silver lamps. For fuel, olive oil was the premium choice if you lived somewhere it was available. It burned cleaner and smelled better than the alternatives. But olive oil wasn't exactly growing everywhere in medieval Europe. So many people had to make do with fish oil, whale oil, or various seed oils. Imagine your house smelling like a fish fry every single night, not exactly Bath and Body Works. The real innovation during the Middle Ages was the development of improved wicks. People discovered that using cotton twisted in specific ways created a more even burn. Some clever medieval lamp makers even designed lamps with multiple wicks for extra brightness, the medieval equivalent of upgrading from a 40-watt to a 100-watt bulb. Oil lamps were relatively safer than rushlights, but they still caused plenty of fires. Plus, they were constantly dripping oil everywhere. Medieval homes often had specialized lamp shelves or niches built into walls to minimize the damage from spills. And cleaning up that oil residue: practically impossible without modern degreasers. No wonder medieval castles always seemed a bit grimy around the edges. Despite these drawbacks, oil lamps remained the reliable workhorses of medieval illumination for centuries, especially for those who could afford the better oils and finer lamps. Number 5. Beeswax candles, luxury lighting for the elite. Ever dropped $50 on a fancy scented candle? That's nothing compared to how precious beeswax candles were in medieval times. These were the Rolls-Royce of medieval lighting, so expensive that they were primarily limited to churches, royalty, and the ultra-wealthy. What made beeswax candles so special? Unlike tallow candles made from animal fat, beeswax burned clean with minimal smoke or odor. They also gave off a noticeably brighter, warmer light and burned much longer. In a world of smoky, stinky lighting options, a beeswax candle was like having lead mood lighting, a total luxury. The production process was ridiculously labor-intensive. First, beekeepers had to carefully harvest honeycombs without destroying their hives. Then came the tedious process of separating the wax from the honey, purifying it, and forming it into candles. The finest beeswax candles were often bleached to achieve a beautiful white color that symbolized purity, which is why churches insisted on them for religious ceremonies. Speaking of churches, the Catholic Church consumed beeswax candles in astronomical quantities. Medieval church records show mind-boggling expenses for candles. Some major cathedrals spent the equivalent of a modern-day fortune just lighting the altar for important feast days. The symbolic connection between the industrious bees, considered miraculous creatures, producing pure wax, and the virginity of Mary made beeswax particularly theologically significant. For the ultra-wealthy, displaying beeswax candles at dinners or events was the medieval equivalent of flashing a Rolex or arriving in a Lamborghini. It screamed, "Look how much money I can literally burn." Some nobles even specified in their wills how many beeswax candles should illuminate their funeral services, medieval flexing from beyond the grave. The demand for beeswax became so great that it developed into a significant trade commodity. Northern European regions shipped enormous quantities of beeswax south and east, while major trading centers like Venice controlled beeswax imports from as far away as North Africa. All this fuss for something we now casually pick up at craft stores. Number 4. Tallow candles, stinky but steady. Would you fill your house with the smell of slaughterhouse leftovers just to see at night? Medieval people did exactly that with tallow candles, the standard lighting source for anyone who couldn't afford fancy beeswax. Tallow is basically rendered animal fat, usually from cows or sheep. Butchers and households saved all those fatty bits you'd normally trim off your meat, melted them down, strained out the gross bits, and turned them into candles. The process was nasty work. Imagine the smell of boiling fat filling your home. No wonder candle making was often relegated to specially designated rooms or outdoor spaces. Once the fat was rendered, candle makers would repeatedly dip wicks, usually made from flax or hemp, into the liquefied tallow, building up layers until they achieved the desired thickness. Alternatively, they would pour the tallow into molds around suspended wicks. Either way, tallow candles were relatively easy to mass produce, making them the everyday lighting solution for middle-class merchants and tradespeople. Here's the thing about tallow candles, though, they were seriously unpleasant. They smoked like crazy, filling rooms with soot that would blacken walls and ceilings. They smelled like burning animal fat, which isn't exactly on anyone's list of favorite scents. They also had an annoying tendency to drip and sputter, occasionally sending globs of hot fat flying onto clothing or furniture. The worst quality tallow candles would literally start to smell like rotting meat if kept too long, especially in warm weather. That's why skilled candle makers developed methods to purify the tallow and sometimes added herbs or other aromatics to mask the smell. The finest tallow candles were made from the hardest fats like those around beef kidneys and properly purified. Guilds of chandlers, professional candle makers, arose in medieval towns with strict quality controls and trade secrets. These guilds often worked closely with butchers, creating an early example of industrial symbiosis, one trade's waste becoming another's raw material. Despite their drawbacks, tallow candles represented a significant step up from rushlights. They burned longer, provided more consistent light, and could be made in standard sizes. For the average medieval household, having a good supply of tallow candles stored away for winter was as essential as having a full pantry. Number 3. Cresset stones, primitive public lighting. Ever walk down a pitch-black street with no streetlights? Medieval towns faced that problem nightly. Their solution: cresset stones, basically the medieval equivalent of street lights, minus the electricity, poles, or anything remotely high-tech. Cresset stones were exactly what they sound like, hefty stones with carved depressions designed to hold oil, grease, or pitch that could be set alight. Imagine a primitive Stone Age-looking object that someone hollowed out cup-sized divots in, filled with something flammable, and then voila, public lighting system accomplished. These crude lighting devices were typically placed at important intersections, near town gates, or outside important buildings like churches or guild halls. Some were mounted on posts or walls, while others sat directly on the ground or on specially constructed platforms. The light they produced was minimal by modern standards, more of a marker than actual illumination, but in a world of absolute darkness, even these faint beacons made a difference. The biggest advantage of cresset stones was their durability. Unlike lanterns or torches that needed constant replacement, a well-carved cresset stone could last for generations. The fuel needed regular replenishing, of course, but the stone itself remained. Some medieval cresset stones can still be found today, their cups worn smooth by centuries of use. Medieval towns often assign the responsibility of lighting and maintaining these public lights to specific officials or neighborhood groups. In some cities, residents were required to contribute oil or tallow for public lighting as part of their civic duties. Imagine your neighborhood HOA demanding you donate cooking oil for the street lights. During important festivals or celebrations, towns would make special efforts to light all their cresset stones, creating what passed for brilliant illumination in medieval terms. Contemporary accounts describe visitors being impressed by towns that maintained even modest public lighting systems, a sign of urban sophistication and good governance. The limitations were obvious, though. Cresset stones provided such limited light that they served more as navigational markers than actual illumination. They were easily extinguished by rain or strong winds. And like all open flames in medieval settings, they posed significant fire hazards, especially when placed near wooden buildings. Still, these primitive lighting devices represented one of the first systematic attempts to push back against the darkness that enveloped medieval streets after sunset. Number 2. Lanthorns, medieval flashlights. Need to walk somewhere after dark without setting yourself on fire. Medieval people faced this dilemma nightly, and their portable lighting solution was something called a lanthorn or lantern in modern English. But these weren't the camping lanterns we know today. Medieval lanthorns were technological marvels for their time, carefully crafted devices designed to solve the problem of carrying light safely. Their defining feature wasn't the light source inside, usually a candle or oil lamp, but the translucent material that protected the flame while allowing light to pass through. Before glass became common, medieval lanthorns used thinly scraped animal horn, hence the name lanthorn, specially prepared parchment, or even thin sheets of mica as their windows. Horn was especially popular. Cattle or sheep horn would be soaked, split, flattened, and scraped until it was thin enough to be translucent. While not completely transparent like glass, these materials allowed enough light to pass through while protecting the precious flame from wind and rain. The frames were typically made of wood or metal with clever design features like hinged doors for accessing the light source, ventilation holes to prevent overheating, and hanging mechanisms or handles. Some even had adjustable shutters to control the amount of light emitted, a medieval dimmer switch. Who carried these lanthorns? Everyone who could afford them and needed to travel after dark. City watchmen carried them on their rounds. Servants used them to guide nobles home from evening entertainments. Doctors brought them on nighttime house calls. Midwives relied on them when summoned to births at odd hours. Tavern goers used them to avoid ending up face down in a muddy ditch on their way home after one too many ales. In many medieval cities, regulations required night travelers to carry lights, both as a safety measure and to prove they weren't up to no good. Sneaking around without a light was considered highly suspicious behavior, potentially earning you a night in the town jail. For the wealthy, lanthorns became status symbols, with ornately decorated metal frames and higher quality materials. Some surviving examples feature intricate pierced patterns in their metal frames, casting beautiful shadow patterns while providing light. Despite their ingenuity, medieval lanthorns had significant limitations. They provided modest illumination at best, and the translucent materials reduced light output considerably compared to an open flame. They required constant attention and maintenance, and if your candle or oil ran out while you were still traveling, you were literally left in the dark. Number 1. Torches, dramatic, dangerous, and disposable. Did you ever wonder why every medieval movie shows people wandering around castles with flaming torches? Were torches really as common as Hollywood suggests? The answer is complicated. Yes, torches were used, but not quite the way films portray them. Real medieval torches weren't the neat, pitch-soaked sticks wrapped in cloth that stay perfectly lit for hours in movies. They were typically made from bundles of resinous wood splints or twisted straw, sometimes dipped in tallow, pitch, or other flammable substances. Some sophisticated torches used rope soaked in flammable materials, twisted around wooden sticks. Unlike the reliable movie props, real medieval torches were messy, unpredictable, and relatively short-lived. They dripped burning material, shed embers, smoked excessively, and typically burned out within 20 to 30 minutes. Imagine walking down a hallway while little bits of flaming material occasionally fall on your clothes or the floor. Not exactly convenient. Given these drawbacks, torches were primarily outdoor lighting sources, used for processions, outdoor gatherings, or situations where the dramatic effect outweighed the practical problems. They were especially common for special occasions, funeral processions, religious ceremonies, or arriving at a castle in style. For indoor use, torches were generally limited to large spaces with stone walls and high ceilings, great halls and courtyards of castles, or spacious church naves. Special torch holders, cressets of iron, were mounted on walls at intervals, designed to catch falling embers. Even then, servants had to be vigilant about replacing torches before they burned down completely, and about cleaning up the resulting mess. The intense but unsteady light produced by torches created dramatic effects of light and shadow, which is why they remained popular for ceremonial purposes even when better options were available. A procession of torch-bearing attendants made a powerful visual statement about the importance of the person they accompanied. Interestingly, in many medieval cities, professional torchbearers could be hired to light your way home after dark. These individuals knew the city streets well and carried proper equipment for dealing with their unruly light sources. Think of them as medieval Uber drivers, but with fire instead of cars. Despite what movies show, most everyday indoor lighting in medieval castles came from more controlled sources like candles, oil lamps, or lanterns. Torches were the special effects of medieval lighting, impressive, memorable, but not what you'd use for reading in bed. Ever thought about how lucky we are to live in an age where light is available at the flip of a switch? Can you imagine spending up to a third of your income just to keep darkness at bay?